Well, all right, we continue our study in Daniel, and this time we're in chapter 8, and this is a difficult chapter. And so we'll work our way through it and we'll see what it says. And here we have some repeat from Daniel 7. It's a second vision, but it still says some of the same things we've already seen, and so we'll move over that part quickly. And so let's start out with the vision recounted. And here we see when this vision was given. As Daniel 8, 1 and 2 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal." So in chapter 7, that vision was in the 1st year of King Belshazzar. Now another one comes 2 years later while Daniel is in Susa. And again, we've seen much of this vision in chapter 2 and 7, so we'll move through it quickly, like I said. And so let's look at the vision, verse 3. "I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." And so here he sees the ram with 2 horns. Now this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and we see that in Daniel 8:20. We're not guessing at this. It says, "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." And again in chapter 7, we saw this is the empire that will defeat and replace the Babylonian Empire. And notice it has 2 high horns, but one was higher than the other that came up last. This is speaking of the relationship between the Medes and the Persians. The Persians emerged after the Medes, but became stronger, thus the higher horn. Now the vision continues concerning the ram. Look at verse 4. "I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great." And so this empire exerted its power, charging west, north, and south. West against the Greeks, north against the Scythians, and south against Egypt. And this was the bear in chapter 7 that was called to arise and devour much flesh. They were motivated by the spirit of conquest and brutally destroyed those around them. And so that's the Medo-Persian Empire. Now we turn to Greece that eventually defeated them. So here's the Grecian Empire. Verse 5. "As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous or dominant horn between his eyes." So as Daniel is marveling at the power and ability of the ram, suddenly a goat with incredible speed and a dominant horn comes from the west. Verse 21 and 22 of chapter 8 tells us this goat is Greece. Now the dominant horn would be Alexander the Great. And it says without touching the ground. This refers to the amazing speed Alexander's empire conquered the then known world. And now watch what happens to the Medo-Persian Empire that was so mighty. Verse 6 and 7. "He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power." So he, talking about Alexander, and the Greek forces, driven by rage, struck the ram. The Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire hated each other, and their battles were fierce and brutal. And it says not only breaking both horns, that would be the Medes and the Persians, but also casting them to the ground to trample on it. That's total and brutal victory. Then look at verse 8. "Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." Now under Alexander, the empire became exceedingly great, but at the height of his power, he was overcome with sickness and died at the age of 32. Again, that's verse 8 again. "But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." So Alexander, being so young, had no successor in place when he died. And so the empire ended up being divided into 4 parts. Each part was ruled by a different general. But these horns were never as powerful as Alexander. But we're told out of those weaker horns, another horn was raised up that was more powerful than them. Verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And so this little horn rises out of the four that replaced Alexander. And now, you've got to understand this. This is not the same little horn we saw in chapter 7. That horn rose out of the fourth beast, which was the Roman Empire, and that horn was the Antichrist. This horn in chapter 8 rises out of the third empire, the Grecian Empire. And this is the man known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He ruled in Syria from 175 to 163 BC, and he assumed the title Epiphanes, meaning illustrious manifestation. So he claimed to be a revelation or an epiphany of the gods. Now the Jews twisted it into Antiochus Epiphanes, which meant madman. And he was anti-Semitic to the core, and he tried to exterminate the Jews in 168 BC. He sent an army of 20,000 to level Jerusalem, attacking the glorious land, that's verse 9. And the army entered the city on the Sabbath, murdering most of the men and taking the women and the children as slaves. He then issued an edict that made the Jewish religion illegal. But the final insult came on December 14th, 168 BC, when he replaced the Jewish altar in the Holy of Holies in the temple with an altar to Zeus and then sacrificed a pig on it. Now, in response to this, a rebellion was led by Judas Maccabeus, who was successful 3 years later when Jerusalem was taken back, the temple was cleansed and rededicated, and Jewish worship was restored. And when the Jews celebrate the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, they are celebrating this event. Now, with that as a background, let's look at what Daniel says about this man. Look at verse 9 again. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So Antiochus started small, the little horn, but grew in strength. Then a very difficult verse, verse 10, look what it says. It says, it, speaking of the horn, we've seen that's Antiochus, it grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Well, fortunately, the Amplified Bible helps us here. Daniel 8:10 in the Amplified Bible says this, and in my vision, this horn grew great, even against the host of heaven, God's true people, the saints, and some of the host and of the stars, priest, it cast down to the ground and trampled on them. So the host of heaven are the Jews, God's true people. It calls the stars priest, and Antiochus replaced or cast down the true priesthood with his own men. So that is accurate. So Daniel predicts that Antiochus will grow great against the people of God and trample on them. Now verses 11 and 12 defines more of what he did. And the NLT is clearer here. And let me read it from there. Daniel 8:11 through 12 in the NLT says, it, again, that little horn, it even challenged the commander of heaven's army by canceling the daily sacrifices offered to him and by destroying this temple. The army of heaven was restrained from responding to this rebellion. So the daily sacrifice was halted and truth was overthrown. The horn succeeded in everything it did. So that's saying this was a deliberate act against God and his people. And it says the armies of heaven were restrained to allow him to do this. Then in verses 13 and 14, we find out how long this persecution would last. Daniel 8:13 and 14 says, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, or abomination of desolation, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? Verse 14, and he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And so the holy ones here are the angels, and they're speaking about the prophetic timetable. And the time the persecution will last is 2,300 evenings and mornings, or in other words, 6 1/3 years. And that is absolutely accurate. The persecution started on September 6th, 171 BC, and ended on December 25th, 165 BC, or 6 1/3 years. Now, let's look at the abomination of desolation, because verse 13 pins it on Antiochus Epiphanes, but that can be confusing because we link this to the Antichrist who commits this in the tribulation period, right? I mean, isn't that what Jesus said in Matthew 24:15? Which was long after Antiochus lived. He said there was going to be the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of in the tribulation. So what's happening here? Did Jesus get it wrong? Well, here it is. There are two different incidents referred to as the abomination of desolation. In Daniel 8:13 and 11:31, we have Antiochus entering the temple and desecrating it. But in Daniel 9:27, Jesus' words in Matthew 24, Paul's writings in 2 Thessalonians, and John's in Revelation 13, those are all speaking of the Antichrist in the tribulation period. So we have two different events called the same thing. What Antiochus did was a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist would do. In fact, he's referred to as the Antichrist of the Old Testament. So here it is. Daniel 8:13 and 11:31 refer to Antiochus, who is a forerunner of the Antichrist. But all the other references refer to Antichrist, who will arise in the tribulation. And you know what? This kind of prophecy where you have a short-term fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment, that's not unusual at all in the scriptures. You see it a lot. And one example is Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9, 6 through 7 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So what we have there is the child was born and the son was given. That's fulfilled, right? But the rest awaits to be fulfilled in Christ's return and when he establishes his kingdom. Another example is found in Joel. Speaking of the future, he says, Joel 2:28, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." And then he goes on to speak of miraculous signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, columns of smoke, the sun becoming dark, and the moon a blood red. Now, what's interesting is Peter takes that and quotes that prophecy on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit had fallen on the new church. What happened was they were all speaking in tongues, and the people heard it and accused them of being drunk. In Acts 2:15 through 17, Peter says, "For these people are not drunk as you suppose, since it is only the third hour of the day. But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. And in the last days it shall be, God declares that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh." And so the prophecy was partially fulfilled when the Spirit was poured out on the new church. But all the miraculous signs in that same prophecy will happen when the Lord returns some 2,000 years later. So here the vision was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes almost 200 years before the birth of Christ. He was a forerunner, or we could say a preview, of the Antichrist who will arise in the tribulation period. And in many ways, the Antichrist will act like Antiochus did. But why not? Both are empowered by Satan, right? So what Antiochus did on a smaller scale, the Antichrist will do on a larger. Now look at verse 19, which gives us a clue when the final fulfillment of this prophecy will happen. Daniel 8:18 and 19 says, "And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation," for it refers to the appointed time of the end. Now the he speaks of in that passage was the angel Gabriel, and we see that in verses 15 through 17. So what happens here is Daniel falls into a deep sleep. He falls face down, overwhelmed by the prophecy, and Gabriel wakes him up and starts giving him more prophecy, more prophetic truth. And here in these verses, we see this vision isn't just about Antiochus Epiphanes. This happens at the time of the indignation, verse 19 tells us, which is another expression for God's wrath that happens during the tribulation period. The Antichrist will be at the height of his power at that point, and the wrath poured out at the appointed time of the end will break his stranglehold on earth. Verse 17 puts it like this, "But he said to me, Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." So this indicates that Antiochus Epiphanes is part of this vision, but it ends speaking of the Antichrist during the tribulation period. Now we've already seen verses 20 and 22, which is the explanation of this vision, so I'll just read it. Daniel 8:20 through 22 says, "As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. Now, let's look at the final section where the focus is on the Antichrist. That's in verses 23 through 27. This is the Antichrist. Daniel 8:23. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressions have reached their limit. The NIV puts it this way: in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked. And so this shows man is going to get worse, much worse, growing in evil until God says enough and brings that final judgment in the tribulation period. The verse continues, during that time a king is going to rise up. That's the Antichrist. So let's look at how these scriptures describe him. Verse 23 again, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. Now, king of bold face, that's interesting. This is a term used for a harlot who is brazen and shameless. In other words, he will be deceitful and ruthless without remorse. This is evil personified. Then it says, who understands riddles. This means he is skilled in intrigue, a master of deception. I mean, he's a typical politician who will use every trick to deceive a gullible world. And it's all designed to exalt himself and amaze the people. Then it says he will be a destroyer who prospers. Verse 24. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. So it says his power is great, but it's not his own power. He is empowered by hell itself. And his reign will be horrifying to any who refuse to bow totally, causing fearful destruction. At this point, you will be forced to take a mark or die. So public beheadings are going to be the norm. This is going to be a horrifying time. Then it says he shall succeed in what he does. The Holy Spirit will no longer be restraining him. Over in Romans 1, you see, as man refuses to go God's way, there is a progressive turning them over to themselves. God allows them to live without him, and he removes his gracious restraints. But here, transgressions have reached their limit. The rejection of God is at its apex. And God has stepped back and said, fine, you get what you want, resulting in the Antichrist and hell being turned loose on earth. Then it says he will destroy mighty men and the saints. So those who come to the Lord in the tribulation period will be martyred. I mean, this is going to be a bloodbath. He is going to destroy anybody who stands in his way, no matter how mighty they are, and he is going to destroy those who believe in Jesus Christ. And that's why you want to come to the Lord now, so you can miss this, right? Next one says he will be dominated by his ego. Daniel 8:25. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. So his deceit is going to work. He's going to be very successful, but that success is going to go to his head. It says in his own mind he shall become great. But his ego leads him into a fatal decision, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. This is the battle of Armageddon, when the Antichrist gathers the armies of the world to fight against Jesus Christ. He thinks he's so great at this point that he can win this war against heaven. But it says, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So Jesus Christ is going to defeat him and his armies, and it's going to be easy, no contest. The rebellion is going to be put down, and Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet are going to be incarcerated into the lake of fire. And I think of the foolishness of man shaking their tiny fist at God. Think that over. You lose. Now let's look at the effects of this vision on Daniel. Daniel 8:27. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So Daniel was exhausted, and he became ill for several days. And notice it says he was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Well, it seems he struggled with why God would allow these evil men to come to power. And I think that's an important thought. So let's think about that. The truth is, we don't always understand what God does, do we? His ways and thinking are above us. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So God's thinking is different. God's ways are different. But how do we handle those situations where we can't understand why God would allow something? Those times where we're tempted to accuse God of being unfair, unwise, and unloving. Well, here's what I've learned to do in those times. I apply what I know to be true about God. He is perfect in all his ways, and he never makes a mistake. Therefore, when I don't understand what he's doing, you know what? That's on me, not him. It's just my little pea brain not being able to grasp the perfection and immensities of his ways. And so the point is, the truth is he is always right. And when I doubt that, I'm the one who is wrong. And I'm the one who has to rearrange my thinking to line up with his. Now in verse 27, he adds something that is interesting considering the times we live in. Look at verse 27. I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. New King James Version says, I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. No one understood it. That wasn't because God didn't want it to be understood. The reason is it was sealed up because it was speaking about what would happen way out in the future. Daniel 8:26 says this, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So it wasn't for them at the time of the writing. The vision was too far off. But you know what? It is now upon us. We are so close to those times this vision is speaking about. So God is now unlocking this passage for his people to understand. And I find it interesting. Daniel is told to seal up the prophecy, for the time is far off. But look at what John is told to write. Revelation 22:10. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. It's time to open our eyes and apply ourselves to understand what this passage is saying. The time is near. All those things it was talking about is near. So let's conclude this then. So again, we have the incredible accuracy of Scripture, don't we? Daniel receives a vision while Belshazzar is on the throne and Babylon is in control. And it accurately describes that the Medo-Persian Empire was on the horizon. They would replace Babylon, followed by the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great, who would be replaced by 4 horns that are weaker than him, but during that time another little horn would arise and become powerful. He would be allowed to persecute God's people and desecrate the temple. But we end up seeing that Antiochus was a preview of things to come. What he did locally in Jerusalem, the Antichrist will do globally. But the Antichrist will be put down suddenly when Christ returns. All right, guys, thanks again for watching. Please hit those buttons down below. It really helps us. And if you want to help in getting the truth out, there are links to support the channel down below. And I really appreciate those who are doing that. God bless all of you, and I'll see you in the next video.